Sao Paulo, 1943. Late on a Tuesday, the exact date is buried in a Brazilian police report that took decades to surface. An officer levers open a crate on a table under a bare bulb, steps back, and looks at what's inside. A human skull, roughly life-size, carved from a single block of clear crystal. Polished to near optical clarity with empty eye sockets that catch the light at an angle that makes them seem, for just a second, to be lit from inside. The officer puts it down, goes to get his supervisor. The men in custody are not art thieves. They are German nationals carrying documentation that connects them to the Ahnenerbe, Heinrich Himmler's personal research division, officially tasked with finding archaeological evidence of an ancient Aryan master race and, in practice, increasingly devoted to tracking down objects of supposed occult power on 5 continents. This wasn't a fringe operation. It was funded by the German state, staffed with credentialed scholars, and answered directly to Himmler himself. These specific agents had been operating in Brazil for months. The skull was in transit to Europe. Nobody recorded where in Europe, or to whom. When questioned, one of the men described the mission as cultural heritage recovery. That's one framing. Another is 2 foreign nationals with false documentation and a crystal skull in a Brazilian police station 2 years before the end of a war they were already losing. The crystal skull sits on the evidence table. We'll come back to it. What they were chasing: a theory circulating through certain German occult circles since at least the 1910s, which held that 13 crystal skulls of Maya origin were scattered across the Western Hemisphere. Gathered and reunited, the story went, they would grant dominion over time and space. Himmler believed this. He committed actual government resources to it. The Third Reich ran a special research division with real personnel, real operational budgets, and active missions on multiple continents, based in significant part on this belief. Which raises the question nobody stops to actually ask: what did the Maya make that warranted this level of obsession? Even granting that Himmler's framework for evaluating evidence was not exactly rigorous, there's something real underneath the mythology. A real civilization, real structures, real achievements that people have been misrepresenting for 2 centuries in both directions. So what did they actually build? The geography first. The Maya were not an empire. No single capital, no central government, no unified territory administered from above. What existed across what is now southeastern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador was something closer in structure to ancient Greece. Dozens of independent city-states, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own religious calendar, its own running conflicts with its neighbors. The comparison isn't exact, but the political logic holds. A shared cultural tradition, a shared writing system, and constant warfare between entities that spoke the same language and worshipped related gods. Several of these cities were enormous. Tikal, in northern Guatemala, may have supported somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people at its height, roughly equivalent to the population of Salt Lake City, Utah, living without iron tools, internal combustion, or plumbing, in tropical jungle that requires constant active clearing to stop it from taking back the farmland. The city covered approximately 60 square miles of lowland forest, an area roughly 4.5 times the size of Manhattan. Then there is La Danta, also in the Guatemalan lowlands, 79 meters tall, about the height of a 25-story building, and by total volume of material moved and stacked, one of the largest structures ever constructed by human hands anywhere on Earth. Larger by volume than anything at Giza. Most people have never heard of it, and the reason is primarily logistical. Reaching it involves a combination of small aircraft, unpaved jungle roads, and the kind of travel day that ends with a headlamp rather than a hotel lobby. Here is a detail that tends to reframe this entire conversation. Over the last decade, archaeologists have been using airborne LiDAR, a laser scanning system that penetrates dense jungle canopy and renders the terrain beneath it, to survey the Maya lowlands. What they have found has overturned almost every previous estimate of the civilization's scale. Entire cities, connected by elevated causeways running for miles, were sitting under the jungle the whole time. Every population figure you have ever seen cited for the classic Maya lowlands has been revised upward. By how much is still being worked out. The most visited Maya site is ChichenItza on the Yucatan Peninsula. The main pyramid, the Pyramid of Kukulkan, sometimes called El Castillo, has 4 staircases of 91 steps each, plus the platform at the top. 365 steps total, one for each day of the solar year. A counting device expressed in stone. You can climb it. But twice a year, at the spring equinox in late March and the autumn equinox in late September, something else happens. In the late afternoon, the sun strikes the northwest corner of the pyramid at precisely the angle required to cast a triangular shadow running the full length of the northern staircase. The shadow forms in a series of interlocking triangles over roughly 3 hours, producing the exact silhouette of a feathered serpent descending from sky to earth. The structure was designed to produce this effect on those 2 specific dates and on no others. Not approximately those dates, on them. You can go and stand at the base of those stairs and watch it happen. It runs on schedule every year without fail. Which raises the actual question, how? How does a civilization without metal tools for construction and without the wheel as a load-bearing mechanism produce a building calibrated to an astronomical event at that level of precision? 2 explanations have been put forward, and they have not been reconciled. The first is accumulation. Centuries, possibly 1,000 years or more, of systematic naked-eye observation, recorded and maintained by a priestly class across generations. A single human lifetime is enough to track Venus with reasonable accuracy. 100 lifetimes builds the foundation for precise predictive models. The Maya astronomical calendar, which accounted for the solar year, the synodic cycle of Venus, the timing of lunar eclipses, and intervals stretching hundreds of thousands of years in both directions from the present, is accurate to within minutes per year by modern calculation. That required institutional memory at a scale most ancient civilizations never sustained. Scholars who favor this theory treat the depth and precision of the astronomical record as the strongest evidence that observation came first and the engineering followed from it. The second theory is about method rather than duration. Several researchers have demonstrated that the serpent shadow at ChichenItza and similar optical effects at other Maya sites can be designed in advance using nothing more than a scaled clay prototype and time. Build a small pyramid, track the shadow across it over the course of a year, adjust the geometry until the effect lands on the right date, then scale it up. The mathematics are embedded in the physical shape of the structure. No calculus needed. Just an accurate model and the patience to keep watching. The 2 explanations imply different kinds of societies. The first requires a priestly institution maintaining continuous records across centuries. The second points toward an engineering tradition, working iteratively at small scale. The evidence is compatible with both. This is a live argument in the academic literature, and nobody has called a winner. The shadow falls on schedule every equinox. What nobody has established, what the current evidence doesn't reach, is who made the decision to build it there, in that orientation, to produce that specific effect on those specific dates. The records that might answer the question were written on fig bark paper in a writing system that took centuries to decode. Most of them were burned in 1562 by a Spanish bishop who called them instruments of the devil. The same bishop is also, almost entirely by accident, the reason we know as much as we do about the Maya. That's where this gets genuinely strange. Mani, Yucatan Peninsula, July 12, 1562. It's midday, which means somewhere north of 35 degrees Celsius, that's about 95 Fahrenheit, in a colonial town that has been built quite deliberately on top of a flattened Maya settlement. The church in the central courtyard stands on foundations made from the broken stones of a Maya temple. The message is not subtle. In that courtyard, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa has assembled the local Maya population, a collection of carved stone idols, and 27 hieroglyphic manuscripts written on folded strips of bark paper. He reads from a prepared statement. Then he orders all of it burned. De Landa recorded afterward that the books contained nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil, and that their destruction caused the Maya present great affliction. That's one way to put it. Another is that a man with no legal authority to conduct what he was conducting, he was a friar, not a bishop, he had not been sanctioned by the colonial government, burned the written record of a civilization in a church courtyard while its living descendants stood and watched. 27 manuscripts from that one afternoon, the total destroyed across the Yucatan, across the entire colonial period, is unknown. Estimates run to several thousand. What survived? 4. 4 codices out of what was almost certainly the written production of a literate civilization spanning more than 1,000 years. The 4 that made it have names. The Dresden Codex is the most celebrated, an astronomical almanac tracking the movements of Venus across nearly 4 centuries, which was sitting in a Dresden library when a German collector bought it in 1739, and which nobody in Europe could read for the next 2 centuries. The Madrid Codex, the longest of the 4, now lives in Spain. The Paris Codex was discovered in 1859, folded inside a piece of paper in a basket at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which is not where anyone expected to find it. The Grolier Codex surfaced in Mexico in the 1960s under disputed circumstances. The most charitable reading of how it reached the market involves someone finding it in a cave and wasn't formally authenticated until 2016. The Dresden Codex has one more survival story that tends to get left out. In February 1945, Allied firebombing raids hit Dresden and damaged the Saxon State Library where it was stored. The most important Maya manuscript in existence survived De Landa's campaign, survived 2 centuries unidentified in a foreign library, and then nearly didn't survive the Second World War. It's fine now. It's been digitized. 4 codices from a civilization that was producing manuscripts for over a millennium. The rest is ash. Written on strips of bark from the fig tree, not papyrus, not vellum, not anything that was going to survive without care, folded accordion style into books that could be several meters long when opened fully. Gone. Here is what makes De Landa hard to place in a simple story. The man who organized the burning also spent years learning Yucatec Maya to real fluency, interviewing elders, attending ceremonies, and recording what he observed in careful detail. He was not incurious. He was, in a sense, the most attentive European scholar the Maya civilization ever had. He wanted to understand it well enough to destroy it. The destruction did not save his career. De Landa had conducted an unauthorized inquisition at Mani. Only bishops had that authority, and he was a friar. And he was recalled to Spain to face charges. He spent years writing his defense, and alongside it, a long manuscript describing Maya culture in depth, agricultural calendars, ritual cycles, the names and attributes of gods, how nobles dressed, how cities were organized, the rules of the ball game. This document, the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, became the primary European source on Maya civilization. It was not published until 1864, 300 years after it was written, and by then the culture it described had been under colonial rule for so long that De Landa's account was the only continuous record left. He was acquitted, returned to Yucatan, and died as its bishop in 1579. The burning happened. The Relación exists. Both are his legacy, and you cannot disentangle them. The Relación also contains what turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. Somewhere around 1566, De Landa sat down with a Maya informant and attempted to build a Maya alphabet, a table matching Maya glyphs to their equivalent Spanish letters. He asked for the glyph meaning A, wrote down what he was shown, asked for B, proceeded through the Spanish alphabet, and concluded he had unlocked the writing system. He had not. Maya script is syllabic. Each sign represents a sound unit, a consonant plus a vowel, or sometimes a vowel alone, and meaning is constructed by combining signs rather than stringing individual letters. De Landa had asked his informant to write the sound of the Spanish letter A, and the informant had dutifully written the Maya syllable for that sound, which is not the same thing as identifying an alphabetic letter. The mistake was fundamental, and because De Landa's Relación was the primary source, every scholar who followed him started from the same broken premise.
For roughly 400 years, longer than the United States has been a country, longer than the span of time since Shakespeare first put Hamlet on stage, the academic mainstream held that Maya inscriptions were essentially decorative, records of astronomical cycles and calendrical data, not history, not names of people, not accounts of wars or dynastic succession. The Maya, in this reading, were timekeepers who carved astronomical cycles into stone, not historians, not storytellers, just the universe's record keepers. That was wrong, demonstrably, comprehensively wrong. But it took until the 1950s for anyone to prove it, and the person who did prove it had never once set foot in Mexico. Before that story, though, there is the question of why we have only 4 codices, and the answer is less settled than it sounds. The obvious theory: De Landa and the other Spanish clergy burned everything they could find, systematically and deliberately, as a matter of colonial policy. The loss is total. What exists in those 4 surviving manuscripts is what remains of the written record. The competing argument: the conquest of the Yucatan was not a single event. It was a slow process that took the Spanish most of the 16th century, spreading region by region. Maya priests would have had decades of warning as the Spanish advanced. The most sacred texts, the ones that mattered most, would have been hidden, sealed in buildings, placed in caves, buried under floors. The Yucatan Peninsula has extensive underground cave systems, many of them incompletely explored.
There are sealed chambers in excavated buildings that have never been opened. The argument, in its strongest form, is that we have not found the hidden manuscripts yet. Not that they were destroyed, that they are waiting. The climate works against optimism.
Fig bark paper in tropical heat and humidity does not last long without active preservation, and anything sealed in the 16th century would, by ordinary physics, have decomposed long since. But cave environments can be surprisingly stable, and stranger finds have emerged from less likely conditions. Neither theory has been disproven. The question stays open, and it matters, because if any manuscripts surface, everything we currently believe about Maya history would need to be revised against new primary sources. What couldn't be burned was stone. The Maya carved their history into pyramid walls, into upright stelae lining processional avenues, into the facades of buildings. Dates, the names of rulers, records of military victories, alliances, ritual sacrifices. Tens of thousands of inscriptions across hundreds of sites, sitting in open air for centuries, while scholars argued about whether the writing system recorded anything meaningful at all. The first humans reached the Americas from Siberia across a land bridge exposed by lower sea levels during the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, about 15,000 years before anyone raised the first stone at Stonehenge. The linguistic ancestors of the Maya settled in southern Mexico around 5,000 years ago. That date comes from reconstruction of related living languages rather than direct archaeological evidence. It's a reasonable working figure, and rougher than it looks. Everything we know about what came after passes through the distorted lens of a man who burned the primary sources and then wrote down what his interpreters told him about them, which is several layers removed from the truth. The stone is more reliable, and what's carved into the stone, once anyone could read it, turned out to be something quite different from astronomical meditation on the nature of time. The best place to start is the site everyone already has a picture of. The problem is that the picture is almost entirely wrong. The water is black, not dark, black. Visibility in the sacred cenote at ChichenItza drops to effectively zero within a meter of the surface. The water has been accumulating silt, pollen, and centuries of organic matter since before any Spanish ship crossed the Atlantic. You are hanging in a limestone shaft roughly 60 meters across, about the width of a 6-lane highway, and you cannot see your own hands. This is where Edward Thompson went looking for bones in 1904. Thompson had been at ChichenItza for a decade by then. He'd purchased the hacienda sitting on the ruins in 1894, which was one approach to archaeological access in an era before excavation permits were meaningfully enforced. He spent those years reading, primarily Delanda's Relación, the document that locked Maya decipherment behind a dead end for 4 centuries, and also happened to contain the most detailed existing account of what the cenote was for. Delanda, drawing on local Maya informants, speaking through interpreters, recorded that during severe drought, the priests and lords of ChichenItza threw living people and precious objects into the cenote as offerings to Chak, the rain god. Those thrown in were not always killed first. Delanda wrote that if any survived the fall and the immersion, they were pulled back up hours later and questioned about what the gods had said. The academic establishment responded the way academic establishments tend to respond to things that sound exciting, with patient, professional doubt. A sacrifice sinkhole full of victims and golden offerings, maintained by a vanished civilization, waiting in the jungle? A ghost story. Thompson went looking anyway.
The Yucatan Peninsula is a flat shelf of porous limestone, several hundred meters thick. No significant rivers run on its surface. The rainfall disappears underground almost immediately, draining through a connected system of caves and channels into a freshwater table below.
When the limestone ceiling over an underground cavity gives way, it opens a shaft to the water beneath, a cenote. There are thousands of them across the peninsula. The Maya built their cities around them because without cenotes, there is no accessible fresh water for most of the year. The sacred cenote is not a decorative feature of ChichenItza. It is a significant part of the reason ChichenItza exists where it does. The cenote runs roughly 60 meters across and sits about 25 meters from rim to waterline. 8 stories of open air before you hit the surface, and then 13 more meters of water before you reach the floor. In certain seasons, blooming algae and suspended pollen turn that water a deep brownish red, somewhere between rust and old blood. The Maya believed the cenote was an entrance to Xibalba, the underworld, a direct channel to the gods who controlled rainfall, and therefore everything. Whatever effect the color of the water was having on the religious imagination of people whose survival depended on what the sky and the earth gave them is not difficult to work out. Thompson's first approach was not a diving helmet. He spent months engineering and importing a dredging apparatus, a large bucket and winch system lowered from the cenote rim, designed to pull cubic meters of sediment up to the bank for sifting. The image people have of Thompson personally descending into the dark in copper diving gear came later, after the dredge had done its initial work over several years. For the first phase, he stood at the rim and sorted through mud. What the mud contained: large deposits of copal incense, the standard Maya offering material, jade beads and ornaments, gold discs, several of them embossed with battle scenes and figures that took years to properly document, carved wooden objects, almost none of them structurally intact. Organic material decomposes in water over centuries, and what Thompson recovered were fragments and residue. And bones. The bones were where the legend got complicated. De Landa's account had emphasized young women, virgins in the more embellished versions that circulated in popular accounts. Thompson's dredge returned remains from men, women, and children across a broad age range. At least 50 individuals by conservative estimate, possibly several times more. The female-specific version of the sacrifice story did not hold up against what was actually in the sediment. Each of the objects Thompson found had something in common. They'd been broken before going in. A jade bead deliberately chipped. A gold disc punched through at the center. Ceramics shattered. The Maya ritual logic here is specific. An offering to the gods must first be removed from the world of the living, which requires killing it. An intact, unbroken object still belongs to whoever made it. Destruction is the offering act. Thompson documented this pattern across hundreds of objects, beautiful things, carefully ruined before being thrown away forever. It gives them a strange quality in a museum case now, objects that were designed to disappear. When Thompson finally dove himself, in a copper helmet and canvas suit, accompanied by a Greek diver he'd brought in, and a young Maya assistant encountering open water for the first time, the work took days. Moving along the cenote floor in near total darkness, feeling through silt, filling baskets by touch. Thompson later wrote of the experience, "I found myself in a somber twilight and a weird world, the home of the ancient dead." He came up with items the dredge had missed: small jade pieces, carved bone fragments, objects lodged in crevices.
By 1910, several thousand items had been crated and shipped to the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard. Thompson believed he had the legal right to do this. He held title to the hacienda. Mexican law on archaeological export was poorly defined at the time and largely unenforced.
What happened on his land was, by his reasoning, his decision. Mexico has seen this differently for a long time. A partial return was negotiated in 1975. Some objects came back, others remain at the Peabody. Exactly how many items Thompson removed and where those not at Harvard actually ended up, his field records are incomplete and portions were destroyed, is still being pieced together. The cenote gave up its contents. What happened to those contents afterward is a different archive, and it's ongoing. Here is what the cenote still has not settled: what it actually was. One reading, the one the legend describes, is that the cenote was an active execution site. Living people were thrown in or drowned as offerings to Cha'ak during drought years. The skeletal material supports this at certain points. Some bones show perimortem injuries consistent with violence, and some individuals appear to have been restrained before entering the water. The ritual accounts in De Landa, unreliable as he is as a source, align with the physical evidence in specific places. The other reading is that the human remains are largely of people who died of other causes: drought-related illness, disease, malnutrition, and were given ritual burial in a site believed to be sacred and directly connected to the gods of water and rain. The objects are votive deposits, not accompaniments to execution. The injuries on the bones are post-mortem damage from centuries of movement in sediment and dredging. The cenote, in this version, was a place of prayer and offering rather than killing. Both positions have serious academic support. The skeletal material from Thompson's dredging was poorly documented and partly lost before modern forensic analysis could be applied. Controlled excavations by Mexican archaeologists in the 1970s and 80s recovered additional material under more rigorous conditions. But the sample size remains small and the interpretation is divided. What went into the cenote and under what circumstances is a question the evidence has not settled, more than a century after the first bones came up. The pyramid of Kukulkan stands about 300 meters from the cenote's rim. Two structures at the same site, operating in completely different registers. One built to be read from the outside, its geometry public, its effects timed to the sun, available to any person standing in the plaza at the right moment. The other, sealed below the surface, its contents darkening in black water for centuries before Thompson sent a dredge down. Thousands of academic papers have been written on the pyramid. Scholars had measured its steps, mapped its orientations, documented its construction phases. What none of them had looked for, what the prevailing theory said shouldn't be there, was anything inside it. Hey, if you've made it through the cenote, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Two quick things before we keep going. Hit the like button if you're finding this useful. It helps the algorithm show this to more people, and this is the kind of video that deserves a wider audience than the algorithm usually gives it. And subscribe to the channel if you want to keep going with this. There's more where this came from. One question while I have you. If you'd been Edward Thompson in 1904, the academic establishment laughing at you, a legendary sacrifice sinkhole in front of you, and a dredging machine you imported at your own expense, would you have gone in? Leave it in the comments. I'll be reading. back to the story. Palenque, 1952. The pyramid here does not announce itself. The Pyramid of the Inscriptions, 27 meters tall, about 9 stories, with a small stone temple on top, looks from the jungle floor like a steep, grassy hill that someone carved steps into. Howler monkeys in the canopy, heat that has nowhere to go in the enclosed valleys of Chiapas, and a pyramid that had been studied intermittently for decades without giving much up. Alberto Ruz Lullier arrived in 1949 to document the hieroglyphic panels in the summit temple. 3 large stone slabs covered in 617 glyphs, one of the longest Maya inscriptions ever found. He was there for the writing. He found something underneath it. What he noticed first, a flagstone in the temple floor with 2 small holes bored through it, then carefully filled and smoothed over. Someone had tried to hide those holes. He had the flagstone lifted. Below it, a rubble-filled staircase descending into the pyramid's core, deliberately packed with debris at every level, deliberately sealed at the bottom. Someone had blocked this. Ruz spent the next 3 field seasons finding out why, hauling stone bucket by bucket in the Chiapas summer heat with no guarantee that anything waited at the other end. The academic consensus at the time was clear and reasonably supported. Maya pyramids were elevated temple platforms. Egyptian pyramids were tombs. Different civilizations, different uses for a structurally similar form. Nobody had ever found a burial chamber inside a Maya pyramid. Nobody, to be fair, had been systematically looking for one. Step 64, at the bottom of the staircase, a sealed stone wall. Behind it, a small triangular landing space. And behind that, a second sealed door. When Ruz broke through into the room beyond, he later wrote that he found himself before an enormous chamber that appeared to have been carved from living rock, a magic grotto adorned with stalactites. The stalactites were real. 13 centuries of mineral seepage had built formations throughout the space. The chamber measured roughly 9 meters long and 4 meters wide, with a ceiling close to 7 meters overhead. In the center of the floor, occupying almost the full width of the room, was a limestone sarcophagus with a massive carved lid. The sarcophagus weighed approximately 20 tons, the rough equivalent of 3 adult African elephants, or a fully fueled military helicopter. Here is the problem it creates. The doorway Ruz had just entered through was considerably narrower than the sarcophagus. The lid alone, at 5 meters long, could not have been brought down the staircase. The sarcophagus could not have been built inside the chamber after the chamber was completed because the chamber walls are integral to the pyramid's structure. There is one sequence of events that works with the physics. The tomb was built first. The sarcophagus was placed inside. Then the pyramid was raised around and above it. All 8-stepped levels, the internal staircase, the glyph-covered temple at the top. The entire structure was constructed as a monument to the man inside. Not a temple with a burial added later as an afterthought. A tomb with a temple on top, built in exactly the same organizing logic as the structures at Giza. Ruz had dismantled the central assumption of Maya archaeology in a single afternoon. Inside the sarcophagus, the skeleton of a man who died in his late 70s, later identified from dynastic inscriptions as Kenich Janab Pakal, Pakal the Great, who ruled Palenque for 68 years and commissioned most of the city's major construction.
His face was covered by a mosaic mask assembled from roughly 200 pieces of jade, weighing a few kilograms total. Jade was the Maya material of immortality, It was the green of water, of growing maize, of everything that sustained life, and it was the substance the gods themselves were believed to be made from. Wearing it in death was a statement about what kind of being you intended to become. Throughout the burial, jade ear spools, jade rings, a jade collar. In the dead ruler's mouth, a single jade bead. This was the Maya equivalent of the Greek coin pressed under the tongue for cheron, the payment for crossing over. The idea that the passage from life to death requires a toll, and that it falls to the living to settle it, emerges in cultures separated by an ocean and 15 centuries without any documented contact. Archaeology keeps finding this. Nobody fully knows what to do with it. Just outside the burial chamber, in the triangular antechamber, the remains of 5 women and 1 man, placed there at the time of Tikal's interment. The interpretation: they were killed to accompany him permanently. The Incas organized something functionally similar at much larger scale. Their mummified rulers continued to hold property and attend ceremonies for generations after death. Each dead emperor's estates were administered by living descendants. At state functions, the mummy was physically present, carried to the event, and a designated spokesperson delivered the ruler's responses in court. Tikal's solution is more architectural: 1 building, 1 man, and a stone tube. The tube runs from the floor of the burial chamber upward through the pyramid's entire interior. Narrow, barely wide enough to pass a hand through, roughly 27 meters of carved limestone channel from the dead ruler to the summit. The interpretation is that priests used it to communicate with Tikal's spirit while performing rituals in the temple above. It's a remarkable thing to commit to in stone, not a metaphor for divine connection, but a physical channel. A dedicated line between the living ceremony and the dead king beneath it, engineered into the original construction, running continuously for over 1,300 years before Ruse found the lower end of it. The carved lid of the sarcophagus is where the argument lives, and it is an argument that has not stopped. The mainstream reading held by every working Maya epigrapher, the lid shows Tikal at the moment of death, positioned along the world tree, the vertical cosmic axis that the Maya understood to connect Xibalba, the underworld, with the surface of the earth and the sky above. The surrounding iconography, serpents, skeletal death figures, solar discs, the open maw of the underworld, has direct parallels in other 7th century Maya carvings at multiple sites. Specialists can identify each element from the established visual vocabulary of classic Maya funerary art. The lid is a cosmological document, recording a dead ruler's descent into, and implicitly, his eventual emergence from the underworld. The competing interpretation, introduced by Eric von Daniken in his 1968 bestseller and periodically revived since, the figure is a man operating a rocket. The object beneath his feet is an engine nozzle. The stylized imagery around him represents mechanical systems and exhaust. The Maya acquired this knowledge from extraterrestrial visitors. Von Daniken's book sold more than 60 million copies worldwide, roughly the current population of Italy. The interpretation has been rebutted in peer-reviewed publications, which is technically how it came to be described as an argument in academic literature. Both versions have been in print for over 50 years. One of them has the support of everyone who has spent a professional career reading Maya iconographic systems. The other has sold more copies. Ruse spent years at Palenque working on those 617 glyphs in the temple above the tomb. He could identify that they recorded something real: names, dates, a dynastic sequence. But the language remained locked. The physical evidence below could be measured and photographed and analyzed for bone density and jade composition. What Tikal himself had commissioned be carved in stone, what he wanted the world to know about his reign, was still out of reach. The person who changed that published his solution the same year ruse broke through the sealed door. He was working from photocopies in a Leningrad apartment. He had never once been to Mexico, and the response from the Western Academy when his paper arrived was somewhere between skepticism and open contempt.
Leningrad, early 1952. In the Institute of Ethnography, in a city that was still rebuilding from a siege that had killed roughly 800,000 people, a young linguist named YuriKnorozov is working through a stack of photocopies he obtained from a colleague who obtained them from a library catalog. He has never seen the original manuscripts. He has no budget for fieldwork. He has, in the final year of Stalin's rule, every institutional reason to focus on something safer than the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. He keeps working anyway. In the Western academic establishment, primarily in the United States and Britain, the awareness of Knorozov was minimal, and the reaction to his announced project ranged from polite doubt to open dismissal. The dominant figure in Maya epigraphy was an Englishman named J. Eric S. Thompson, who had spent 30 years producing definitive catalogs of Maya glyphs and establishing the field's methodological norms. Thompson was not enthusiastic about the prospect of being corrected, certainly not by a Soviet linguist who had never visited a Maya site, working from reproductions in a city on the other side of the Iron Curtain. When asked about Knorozov's qualifications, Thompson made his position clear with a consistency that bordered on performance. What Thompson was missing was the answer. Delanda's broken alphabet had been sitting at the center of Maya decipherment for nearly 400 years, roughly the span of time between the first permanent English settlement in Virginia and the present day. Every serious attempt at reading the script had started from Delanda's one-symbol, one-letter framework and ended at the same wall. The glyphs wouldn't resolve. The texts stayed dark. Knorozov's paper, published in Soviet Ethnography in 1952, reframed the problem structurally. The glyphs are not letters. They're syllables. Each sign encodes a consonant-vowel combination, sometimes just a vowel, and words are built by chaining syllable signs together. It is not alphabetic writing. It is something closer to how Japanese kana functions, discrete phonetic units that assemble into meaning when read in sequence. What made this verifiable rather than theoretical was a resource that had been available the entire time: living people. Approximately 2 million individuals across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras spoke various Maya languages as their first language in the early 1950s. Today, that number is closer to 6 million. Maya is not a dead language family. It is a group of related living languages spoken by communities whose ancestors have been in the same region for 3,000 years. The phonological patterns Knorozov identified in the ancient glyph signs matched patterns in the modern spoken languages with a regularity that statistics alone could not explain. The ancient writing and the living speech belonged to the same system. When someone asked Knorozov reportedly why he'd never traveled to the Maya sites himself, his answer was something close to, "A Soviet scientist does not need to leave his office to study the Maya." The phrasing varies by source. The sentiment is consistent. He was a linguist solving a structural problem in linguistics. The fieldwork was a different department. Thompson's response, when the paper reached the West, was not a point-by-point methodological refutation. It was a dismissal on political grounds. Knorozov's work was communist propaganda, produced in the service of Soviet ideology, and should be evaluated accordingly. He applied this characterization with his considerable institutional weight, in journals, in correspondence, in his influence over which scholarship American and British Mayanists took seriously.
This is an unusual charge to level at a claim about whether Maya glyphs represent syllables. The syllabic structure of a pre-Columbian writing system is not in any obvious way an ideologically loaded position. But the early 1950s were not operating on obvious logic. Soviet science was presumed by much of the Western Academy to be ideologically shaped at the source, which meant any finding coming out of Soviet institutions could be dismissed on provenance grounds rather than evidentiary ones. Thompson knew how this worked and used it. Why it took 20 years for the international community to formally accept Knurozov's findings is a question that gets two different answers depending on who you ask. The first answer is politics, the one just described. McCarthyism in the United States, the general suspension of intellectual exchange across the Iron Curtain, and Thompson's specific mobilization of Cold War suspicion as a scholarly weapon. In that climate, Knurozov's paper couldn't get a fair hearing regardless of its merits. The second answer is disciplinary. Knurozov was a linguist working with statistical frequency analysis of sign distributions. The scholars who controlled Maya studies were archaeologists, art historians, and classicists who had built their expertise on a different set of methods. They couldn't fully evaluate what he was doing because it wasn't their training. The resistance wasn't only political, it was also the ordinary resistance of a field being asked to adopt tools it didn't recognize. Which of these factors would have been sufficient on its own? Whether Knurozov's findings would have been accepted faster in a politically neutral environment, or resisted anyway on methodological grounds, is genuinely unknowable. Historians of science argue about it. The person who did most to actually shift the field was a Russian-born American researcher named Tatyana Proskuryakov. Working from inscriptions at the site of Piedras Negras in 1960, she demonstrated that stela recorded actual historical sequences, births, political accessions, military victories, in patterns that repeated predictably across individual rulers. She was reading dynastic history from stone. This required the syllabic framework to function. Once her findings were accepted, and they were accepted relatively quickly because her methodology was transparent and her evidence was dense, the ground shifted. If the inscriptions recorded real historical events, the inscriptions had to be legible. Knurozov had provided the key. Now, the better story, which is probably not true. The popular version of Knurozov's origin goes like this. In the chaos of the final Soviet push into Berlin in May 1945, a young Red Army soldier, Knurozov, runs into a burning library and rescues a Maya codex from the flames. That book, miraculously salvaged from the ruins of the Third Reich, becomes the text he works from for the rest of his career. It's a perfect story, a wartime act of cultural heroism, a vanished civilization preserved by accident in the middle of the most destructive war in history. It has everything. What the documentary evidence shows. Knurozov was involved in operations in and around Berlin in 1945, which is consistent with his service record. He may have removed books from damaged buildings. This was widely documented Soviet practice during the final campaigns. His serious scholarly engagement with MayaWriting began at Moscow State University in 1946, drawing on reproductions of the codices that were available in academic libraries and had been for decades. No singular rescued manuscript, no dramatic moment, just a graduate student who noticed something nobody else had noticed working from materials anyone else could have accessed. The better story loses the person.
Knurozov didn't crack a dead language because he happened to grab the right book from a fire. He cracked it because he was a linguist who looked at the problem as a linguist rather than as an archaeologist or an art historian. And because he understood that the descendants of the civilization whose writing he was studying were still alive and still speaking. What the decipherment actually produced: most Maya inscriptions can now be read. Not all. Certain signs have contested readings, and new combinations emerge from excavations every year that require fresh analysis. But the structure of the writing system is understood, and the corpus is expanding continuously. Epigraphers from Russia, Germany, the United States, Guatemala, Japan, and Mexico are actively working through texts that have never been analyzed. The project Knurozov launched in 1952 has no defined endpoint. Reading the words, though, is not the same thing as understanding what they describe. The surviving inscriptions are primarily dynastic and ritual, records of rulers, battle victories, calendar ceremonies, astronomical events. They tell us how the Maya elite wished to be remembered. They tell us considerably less about how people actually lived, what they ate, what they argued about, how a family moved through a day in a classic period city. That record survives in what went into the ground and what archaeologists pulled back out of it. We have the texts, we have the tombs, we have the pyramids, the cenotes, the buried cities the LiDAR scans are still finding. So what does the whole picture actually tell us about how the Maya lived? Dawn, somewhere in the Maya lowlands, 7th century. In a painted room at the top of a palace, the Aha, the one who speaks loudly, which is the literal meaning of the title, which is to say the ruler, is preparing to address the gods directly. This requires blood. His own. A carved obsidian blade lies on a cloth beside a bowl of copal resin. Attendants wait near the doorway. Outside, the city is already moving through its mourning. The blade finds its mark: tongue or earlobe, or the soft skin of another body part, depending on the occasion and what the calendar has called for. The blood-soaked cloth goes into the fire, and the smoke carries the offering. In the altered state that follows, blood loss, smoke, shock, or some combination, the gods respond. This is not a fringe event in Maya religious practice. It is standard ritual technology, and it was performed by men and women of the noble class throughout the classic period. Both of the dominant myths about this civilization need to go before we go any further. The first, the Maya were a peaceful civilization of astronomer priests living in ecological harmony, observing the stars, managing the calendar, at peace with each other and with the land. This version had a significant following in certain parts of the 20th century, and it was wrong in essentially every particular. The inscriptions, once Knurozov's decipherment opened them to proper reading, turned out to be dense with warfare. Cities burning, rulers taking captives, dynasties being broken by force. The Maya were not unusual in this. They were human. The second, a civilization defined by industrial-scale human sacrifice, organized around death, its every institution saturated with blood ritual. Also wrong. This version conflates classic Maya culture with the Aztec imperial system, distinct cultures separated by several centuries, significant distance, and substantially different institutional arrangements. The equivalent of using the practices of the medieval Catholic Inquisition to characterize ancient Greek religion, because both are European and involve death. The political structure was this. dozens of independent city-states, each governed by an Aha. Not exclusively men. Women held the title of Aha, ruled cities in their own right, and appear in inscriptions as military and political actors across the Classic period, roughly 300 to 900 of the Common Era. This is more politically equitable than most contemporary civilizations that tend to get credited for being advanced, and it gets considerably less attention than it deserves. The wars were real, constant, and purposeful. The primary goal of most classic Maya conflicts was not population annihilation, but the capture of high-status enemies, rival lords, their families, their political allies. Cities were occasionally burned. Alliances were made and reversed across generations. The inscriptions record all of this in obsessive detail. Specific dates, specific prisoners taken by name, specific victories commemorated in carved stone for centuries. The peaceful Maya interpretation was not an invention. It was a translation error. Early scholars reading certain glyph sequences rendered what the inscriptions described as specific military victories as wars lasting one day, the logical equivalent of reading VE Day as evidence that the Second World War was a 24-hour event. Once the decipherment corrected the readings, the war records became unmistakable. The bloodletting instruments found at Maya sites are not crude. They are small, precisely knapped obsidian blades finished with the same craft as the finest jade work, designed specifically for controlled cuts to soft tissue. Stingray spines were also used, threaded through wounds in the tongue or lips or skin.
Delanda documented this in the Relación, describing priests who collected blood on paper and burned it, observing that by this sacrifice they held the gods greatly appeased. He watched it happen. He found it incomprehensible. He also managed not to notice the parallel with the Inquisition. The blood was the repayment of a cosmological debt. The gods had made humanity using their own divine blood. Humanity owed blood in return. The altered states produced by the practice, from blood loss, from smoke, from physical shock, were not side effects of the ritual. They were its purpose. The gods communicated through the hallucination. That was the point of the exercise. The ball game needs a longer explanation than it usually receives. The Mesoamerican ball game had been played in various forms for at least 3,000 years before the Classic period reached its peak. The rubber ball, produced from the sap of the Castilla elastica tree, which grew in the Maya lowlands and gave the Maya access to natural rubber long before any European had seen the material, could weigh up to 4 kilograms in its larger ritual forms. That is roughly the weight of a newborn baby. Solid, kept in play using only the hips, shoulders, and elbows. No hands, no feet. The ball represented the sun moving across the arc of the sky. The court was the sky. The game was cosmological theater with serious athletic requirements. The Great Ball Court at ChichenItza is 168 meters long, longer than an American football field, end zones included, and 70 meters wide. The stone rings mounted on the side walls, through which the ball could theoretically be sent, are set 6 meters off the ground and are roughly the diameter of a steering wheel. What was played on that court, with those rules and that ball, was not casual recreation. Whether the losing players were killed afterward is a question that has not been settled.
One reading. The decapitation imagery at multiple ball courts records a regular practice of sacrificing the game's losers, or its winners. The sources are ambiguous on this point, as part of the ritual logic of the game. Spanish colonial accounts describe post-game executions.
The iconography is documented at too many sites to explain away. The other reading? The individuals sacrificed at ball courts were war captives specifically brought in for ritual matches staged as part of their execution. The game was the manner of their death, not its cause. They were going to die regardless. Ordinary athletic competition between non-captive players operated without lethal stakes. Both positions have credible advocates. Both have problems with the physical evidence. The debate continues. War captives were the primary source of sacrificial victims across the Classic period. After increased contact with the Aztec Empire, organized around sacrifice at a scale classic Maya civilization did not approach, certain Maya groups adopted practices previously unusual in their region. Surgical removal of a living person's heart, performed by a specialist at the top of a pyramid. The officiating priest would afterward put on the dead person's skin and dance. The Spanish missionaries who documented this were, by their accounts, genuinely horrified. Several wrote at length about the barbarism. These were the same men currently overseeing the burning of Maya books, the torture of Maya priests under unauthorized inquisition, and the operation of an inquisition that had spent several centuries burning people alive across Europe. The horror was real. The vantage point was interesting. One last thing, because it keeps coming up. Why did the Maya never use the wheel for transport? They understood the concept. Archaeologists have found wheeled ceramic figurines, small animals on axles, clearly intended to roll, from multiple Mesoamerican sites. The wheel as a mechanical idea was not unknown. As a transport solution, it went nowhere. The reason is practical. Wheeled vehicles become useful when large animals pull them. The Maya had no horses, no oxen, no cattle, no draft animals above the weight of a turkey. Goods moved by human porter and coastal canoe. The wheel solves a problem you don't have if you're not using animal traction, and the Maya were not using it. So, a civilization of dozens of independent city-states, almost continuously at war, governed by nobles who cut themselves to communicate with the divine, playing a solar cosmological ball game on courts the length of a football field, moving everything overland on human backs, and building some of the largest stone structures on Earth. A world in full operation. By around 900 of the Common Era, in the central lowlands of what is now Guatemala and Belize, that world went quiet. Cities were abandoned. The last monuments were razed, and then no more monuments came. The jungle returned to the streets. Nobody left a note. That's the next part of the story, and it's still being argued. Tonina, Chiapas, 909 of the Common Era. On a hillside terraced into a massive ceremonial platform, a stonemason is finishing a carved monument, a stela, one of thousands raised across the Maya lowlands over the previous 6 centuries. This one records the usual things: the deeds of a ruler, a calendrical date, the dynastic lineage going back to divine ancestors. The stonemason does not know it. No one around him does. But this monument, Monument 101 at Tonina, will be the last stela raised in the classic Maya lowlands. The tradition that built cities across an area the size of France will not produce another one. The next ruler who might commission a monument like this will not commission it. There is no next ruler. By the time anyone cuts stone here again, 12 centuries will have passed. The site will be a grassy hill used to pasture cattle.
The timeline of the classic Maya collapse runs from roughly 800 to 900 of the Common Era. During that century, the great cities of the central lowlands go quiet, one after another. Copan, in what is now Honduras, stops erecting monuments around 820. Quirigua around 810. Palenque, Dos Pilas, Caracol. Dynastic centers that in some cases had been continuously occupied for 5 centuries fall silent in sequence. The pattern, when you map it, looks less like simultaneous catastrophe and more like a wave moving through a network. No mass graves to indicate epidemic, no burned destruction layers across all sites to suggest conquest, no seismic event, no volcanic ashfall, no geological marker of any kind. The cities did not die violently. They emptied. The last dated inscription at Tikal, at its peak one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere, its streets at the 7th century's height, holding more people than Rome managed during Augustus, was carved in 869. Within a generation, a city that size was being reclaimed by forest. Cecropia trees grow fast in abandoned clearings. Within a decade, the streets were gone. The dominant explanation involves 2 systems failing simultaneously. Maya agriculture in the central lowlands ran on slash-and-burn cultivation. Clear a section of forest, farm the plot until the soil gives out, clear the next section, allow the previous one to recover. The system works when the population-to-land ratio gives the forest time to regenerate. By 800 of the Common Era, the central zone was supporting an estimated population of several million people in an area roughly the size of England. The forest was not recovering fast enough. Soil was exhausting faster than new land could be cleared. Into this, beginning around 800 and intensifying through the following century, a series of prolonged droughts. The evidence for them is not from written records, there aren't any, but from lake sediment cores. Cores extracted from the bottoms of lakes across the Yucatan preserve, in layered sediment, the pollen and mineral composition of each passing century. The drought signal in those cores is not ambiguous. Multiple sequential dry periods, each lasting years to decades, falling across the lowlands at precisely the moment the agricultural system was already under maximum stress. The lake sediment method works because pollen decays slowly in anaerobic lake environments. Each layer of sediment contains pollen from the plants that grew near the lake that year. Changes in forest species, expansion of disturbance plants, charcoal signatures of burning, evaporation minerals that spike during dry years, all of it accumulates in a readable sequence. The dating at century-level resolution is still being refined, but the basic pattern is consistent across multiple sites. Skeletal analysis from burial context in the final decades before abandonment shows signs of malnutrition in individuals who, based on burial goods and location, were members of the ruling class, not commoners, lords, the people who ate first, who commanded the agricultural surplus of entire city-states, were showing bone lesions consistent with chronic nutritional deficiency. The kings were going hungry. The political events of that century, dynasties breaking down, military conflicts becoming more desperate and less ritualized, succession crises piling up without resolution, are not the cause of what happened. They are what the collapse looked like from inside. The skin of an ecological failure wearing political clothes. How fast it happened is where the field splits, and where both of the main theories have real problems. The slow grind school holds it was cumulative, decades of degradation,
each city's abandonment a local event driven by its own specific failures. A drought here, a military defeat there, a succession crisis that had no good outcome. The collapse is the aggregate of many small endings rather than one large one, and its apparent wave pattern is coincidence, or the natural result of several cities sharing the same ecological constraints on the same timeline. The Cascade School argues for a trigger. Interconnected systems under stress fail differently from isolated ones. In a network, a single failure point can pull adjacent nodes down with it. Take out a key city that anchors trade routes and tribute flows, and the cities that depended on those networks suddenly face crises they were already too weakened to manage. One bad agricultural season cascades into a political collapse that cascades into an abandonment sequence. The wave pattern on the map in this reading is not coincidence.
The evidence supports elements of both. The abandonment sequence does show regional clustering that suggests some kind of contagion between sites. But the pace, measured in decades, not years, fits the slow grind model better than a fast cascade. Neither theory accounts for all the data. Neither has been disproven. The question is still open, and new soil chemistry and climate data from ongoing excavations keep adjusting the picture. Here is the correction that changes everything. The Maya did not disappear. The collapse was specific to the central lowland zone, northern Guatemala, Belize, the southern Yucatan fringe. On the Yucatan Peninsula proper, cities kept functioning. ChichenItza flourished centuries after Tikal went silent. New powers rose and fell in the north. In the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas, Maya polities continued without interruption through the entire period of the so-called collapse. The last fully independent Maya city-state was Tikal, on an island in Lake ChichenItza in northern Guatemala. Spanish expeditions passed through the region repeatedly across the 16th and 17th centuries and left it alone. Too remote, too difficult, not worth the campaign. A Franciscan friar named Avendaño reached the island in 1695 and left an account of what he found: a functioning Maya city-state, temples intact, ceremonies continuing, a ruling dynasty in place. He described the settlement as great and very populated, its religious life maintained as in the times of their ancestors. He also noted that the Itza had been maintaining a ceramic statue of a horse, the horse Hernán Cortés had left behind with them in 1524, which had died shortly after and been elevated to the status of a deity. 17 decades of sustained worship of a Spanish soldier's sick horse. The Itza let Avendaño visit their temples and then asked him to leave. The Spanish came back in force in 1697. By then, Isaac Newton had already published the Principia Mathematica. Louis XIV was in his 54th year on the French throne. The War of the Spanish Succession was about to begin. When Tikal fell, it fell in the early modern world. That was not the end. In 1847, Maya communities across the Yucatan rose in armed revolt against the Mexican government and encroaching plantation agriculture. The Caste War of Yucatan, one of the most sustained indigenous rebellions in the history of the Western Hemisphere. By the 1850s, the rebels had established an independent state in the eastern Yucatan called Chan Santa Cruz, with its own political structure, its own military, and a religious institution, the Speaking Cross, an oracle that issued instructions and maintained the movement's authority. The Mexican government fought them for decades without achieving resolution. Dismantling Chan Santa Cruz required modern artillery and gunboat operations along the Yucatan coast.
The campaign wasn't considered complete until 1901. Scattered resistance continued for another decade and a half. The last organized Chan Santa Cruz fighters laid down arms in 1915, 18 years into the 20th century, 9 years before the first Maya archaeological site was listed on a UNESCO predecessor registry. 6 million people speak Maya languages today. The civilization was interrupted. It was not concluded. Which returns us to where this video started. A crystal skull, a Brazilian police station, and the question nobody asked about what the Nazis actually thought they'd found. We have enough now to answer it. The skull is still on the evidence table in Sao Paulo. The bare bulb overhead, the 2 men in custody, the crate open on the table, and the thing that came out of it sitting in the light. Polished, clear quartz, roughly the size and shape of a human skull, the eye sockets catching the light in that way. We've been through 7 chapters. We know the civilization now. Its pyramids and cenotes, its wars and bloodletting rituals, its ball courts and astronomical precision, the writing system that took 4 centuries to unlock, the collapse that wasn't actually a disappearance, the city-state that held out until the year Isaac Newton published the Principia. We know enough to answer the question we opened with. What is the skull? Where did it come from? And why were the Nazis willing to die for it? The first crystal skull surfaced in England in the 1880s, exactly at the peak of European fascination with Mesoamerican civilizations, in the wake of explorer accounts and the first organized archaeological expeditions to Maya sites. Within a decade or two, several more appeared. All of them materialized in roughly the same window. All of them showed up in the hands of European antique dealers, never from a controlled excavation, never with a provenance chain that survived scrutiny. The timing was not coincidental. The mythology of 13 skulls, united, they grant the bearer dominion over time and space, appears to have crystallized in the same period, circulating through European occult circles in the late 19th century, picking up elaborations as it passed from hand to hand, arriving at its full form by the early 20th century. Where the number 13 came from is unclear. The Maya did use 13 in their calendar systems. That was probably sufficient. The most famous individual skull belongs to a private collector in Canada and was once owned by a British adventurer named Frederick Mitchell Hedges.
He claimed his adopted daughter Anna had found it during an excavation at a Maya site in British Honduras in 1924. Mitchell Hedges named it the Skull of Doom and wrote in his memoir that it was at least 3,600 years old and had been used by the high priest of the Maya to will death. It first appears in documented history at a Sotheby's auction in 1943, where Mitchell Hedges bought it. This is generally understood to mean he had previously sold it, which significantly complicates the 1924 discovery story. The skull is a beautiful object, approximately 5 kilograms of clear quartz, polished to optical quality. It was analyzed by the Smithsonian Institution in 2008. The results were consistent with the known forgeries. It was made somewhere in Europe, sometime in the 19th century. In 1992, the British Museum and the Smithsonian Institution conducted independent forensic analyses on the skulls in their respective collections. The results matched. Surface tool marks on both skulls were consistent with rotary cutting wheels, the standard lapidary equipment of 19th century European gem cutting workshops, unavailable to any pre-Columbian craftsman anywhere. No skull examined showed the microscopic marks that would be left by the abrasive cord technique
used in pre-Columbian hard stone carving. One skull was carved from a variety of quartz that does not occur naturally anywhere in Mexico or Central America. It came from somewhere else, most likely Brazil or the European Alps. The Mohs hardness scale rates quartz crystal at 7. Obsidian, the hardest material the classic Maya worked in any quantity, runs between 6.5 and 7. Carving quartz with obsidian tools at the level of precision these skulls display would require a specific mechanical action that leaves identifiable microscopic traces in the crystal structure. Those traces are absent. Steel cutting signatures are present. The forensic verdict was unanimous across independent teams, and subsequent analyses on additional skulls have not changed it. Where, specifically, the skulls were made is the one point in this story that hasn't been resolved. One strong candidate is Idar Oberstein, a town in what is now the Rhineland-Palatinate region of Germany, with a centuries-long tradition of lapidary work in hard quartz stones. By the late 19th century, Idar Oberstein was the center of European hard stone carving, with the technical capacity to produce precisely this kind of object and the trade networks to move it into the European antique market. The tool marks are consistent with the methods used there. The other candidate is the broader Parisian and London antique trade, where skilled craftsmen produced pre-Columbian discoveries for wealthy collectors who preferred not to ask detailed questions about where things had come from. The antique market of the 1880s and 90s was not known for its rigor. Both explanations fit the forensic data. Neither has been proven. The skulls were made in Europe in the 19th century and sold as ancient Maya artifacts. Beyond that, open question. Himmler was a true believer, and this cannot be emphasized enough as a matter of historical record. He did not cynically use occult mythology for propaganda purposes while privately disbelieving it. He believed the Holy Grail was physically buried at Montségur in the Pyrenees. He believed the Nordic race had originated in Atlantis. He believed crystal skulls could bend time. He funded a full expedition to Tibet in 1938, sending a scientific team across Central Asia at considerable expense and logistical difficulty in the middle of the political crisis leading to the Second World War, to measure skull dimensions in the search for evidence of original Aryan civilization. He had people searching for runic inscriptions in Scandinavia. He had researchers trying to find the Grail. The Ahnenerbe, at its peak, employed over 100 researchers across multiple disciplines. It had operating budgets, administrative staff, publication programs, and active missions on multiple continents. It was, in other words, a real institution doing real work, animated entirely by things that were not true. The agents in Brazil in 1943 were conducting an operation consistent with everything else the Ahnenerbe ran. Go to South America, find a skull, bring it back, use it somehow. Here is the thing that makes the whole structure fold in on itself. The crystal skulls had not come from Mexico. They had not been made by the Maya. They had been manufactured in Europe, probably in Germany or France, within living memory of the men arrested carrying one through Sao Paulo. The mythology surrounding them had been assembled in European occult circles, from fragments of misread ethnography and deliberate mystification, applied to a civilization those circles understood almost entirely through forgeries and distortions. The Nazis were not pursuing a Maya secret. They were chasing a story that European culture had written about itself, dressed in the borrowed imagery of an ancient American civilization, and then forgotten it had written. The skull in that evidence room was European. The mission was European. The myth was European. The Maya had nothing to do with any of it. What the Maya actually left behind is not a set of objects that grant power. It is something considerably harder to dramatize and considerably more difficult to dismiss. A complete, complex civilization that developed independently from every other major tradition on Earth, solved many of the same problems those traditions faced, and arrived at solutions that are in some cases still not fully explained. How did they calculate the length of the solar year to within minutes of accuracy, using only naked-eye observations from pyramid tops, with no metal instruments, no telescopes, no exchange of data with any other astronomical tradition? The Maya solar year measurement was more accurate than the Julian calendar that European civilization was using 1,000 years later. Not in the same ballpark, more accurate. From a pyramid, in the jungle, without a single piece of metal equipment. The question worth sitting with is not how anyone thought crystal skulls could explain this. The question is why the actual story, a civilization that solved these problems under conditions that should have made it impossible, keeps losing ground to the invented one. What this video can leave you with is the thing the skull was never going to provide. Not a magical object, but a comparison. A civilization that built everything it built without inheriting the accumulated technological debt of the old world. No iron, no draft animals, no writing system handed down from a prior tradition, and still arrived at writing, mathematics, and an astronomical record more accurate than anything Europe produced in the same period. What that says about what human beings can do without a running start is the last thing worth carrying out of here. A highland market in Chichicastenango, Guatemala, on any given Sunday. Smoke from copal incense, the sound of quiche being spoken all around you. A Maya woman selling textiles woven on a backstrap loom, the same basic loom type used in the Classic period, 1,000 years ago, in a specific combination of colors and geometric patterns that identifies her village, her family, her weaving tradition. A tourist stops to take a photograph and asks, through a guide, how old the design is. She says it has always been that way. She is not offering mysticism. She is stating a fact about continuity that the tourist, coming from a culture that reinvents its aesthetic vocabulary every decade or two, doesn't quite have a frame for. The patterns predate the Spanish. They predate the collapse. They are older than the country she is a citizen of. She knows the names of all of them in Quiche Maya, one of the 22 Maya languages currently spoken in Guatemala. The civilization did not vanish. The thread did not break. It was cut at repeatedly, and it held. The single most useful frame for understanding the Maya is convergent evolution, the phenomenon in which different species, developing in complete isolation from each other, independently arrive at the same solution to the same biological problem. A bat's wing and a bird's wing function similarly. They evolved from entirely different genetic starting points, along entirely different pathways, with no exchange of information between them. The problem, sustained controlled flight, is real and constrained. The solutions are therefore going to look similar, because physics doesn't offer unlimited options. Civilizations work the same way. A sufficiently large and complex society that needs to track time across generations develops a calendar. When it needs to record transactions and histories, it develops writing. When it needs to count large numbers efficiently, it develops a positional number system. And a positional number system eventually requires a placeholder for empty positions, a zero. The Maya invented zero independently. The Maya concept of zero as a positional placeholder appears in their numerical inscriptions by at least the 4th century before the Common Era, and possibly considerably earlier. The formal development of zero as a mathematical concept in India, associated most closely with the mathematician Brahmagupta, dates to the 7th century of the Common Era. These two traditions were not in contact. The same problem, encountered by two different civilizations on opposite sides of the world, produced the same answer. This is not a mystery. It is an argument about the structure of problems. The Indian zero became the zero the modern world uses. It traveled through Arabic mathematics into Europe and then globally. The Maya zero stayed in Mesoamerica and was later suppressed along with nearly everything else. This is not a mathematical accident. It is a political one. Two equally valid solutions to the same problem, and one of them was treated as if it had never existed for 5 centuries by people who hadn't noticed the other one until it was too late to matter. The pyramids tell the same story. The Maya built large, stepped pyramid complexes without any knowledge of Egypt. Egypt built its pyramids without any knowledge of Mesoamerica. Both civilizations had a need, a structure that expressed permanence, religious authority, and the elevation of the sacred above the ordinary. The architectural solution, a massive, stable base tapering upward, built from locally available stone, is one of the few structural forms that scales from small to very large without requiring materials or engineering concepts unavailable to either culture. It is the shape a stable, large, monumental structure wants to take when you are building it from stone blocks without steel. Two civilizations arrived at it because the physics of the problem leaves limited options. This is not a story about ancient wisdom traveling across the oceans. It is a story about the constraints of physics and the predictability of human problem-solving when the problems are the same. A viral video claiming the Maya had contact with extraterrestrials pulls tens of millions of views. A rigorous documentary about Maya epigraphy, accurately presenting the decipherment and what the texts actually say, gets a fraction of that. This is not an algorithm problem. The algorithm serves existing demand. The demand itself, for mystery, for external explanation, for a story in which human achievement at this scale requires a non-human source, is the thing worth examining. The Maya are an ideal surface for projection, partly because the documentary record has genuine gaps. Delanda's burning left real holes. The tropical climate dissolved much of the rest. In those gaps, people put what they need: aliens, crystal skulls, Atlantean seed knowledge, a secret that the mainstream archaeology community won't reveal. The gaps are real. What fills them is not. What the actual civilization gives you, once the projections are removed, is something harder to summarize and more durable than any of the substitutes. Writing, mathematics, and an astronomical calendar of extraordinary precision, produced under material conditions harder than those facing any contemporaneous complex society in the Old World. No large domesticated animals, no wheel for transport, no major navigable rivers to seed trade networks. And still, cities of several 100,000 people, a positional number system with zero, astronomical records accurate to within minutes per year, an architectural tradition that produced some of the largest structures on Earth by volume. It was built by people using the resources they had, solving the problems in front of them, without a cheat code from space. That should be the headline. It generally isn't. 6 million people speak Maya languages today. The woman in the market in Chichicastenango is among them. The civilization was disrupted. It was not concluded. The question that has no settled answer is the counterfactual, and it deserves to stay open. If the Spanish had never arrived, what happens? The soil depletion and deforestation data suggest that by the 15th century, the northern cities were approaching some of the same ecological limits that brought down the central lowlands in the 9th. The patterns visible in the lake sediment cores, thinning forest cover, expanding agricultural clearing, the early signatures of soil stress, were present in the Yucatan, just slower and less acute. One reading of the evidence: the collapse was coming regardless. The Spanish accelerated a process already underway. The other reading: the northern Maya were adapting. New agricultural techniques appear in the archaeological record across the post-classic period. Raised fields, terracing, intensive kitchen gardens that don't exhaust the soil the way slash and burn does. Trade networks were expanding. Political structures were reorganizing. Complex societies under pressure generate responses to that pressure, and the Maya had demonstrated repeatedly, through the classic collapse, through the conquest, through 3 centuries of colonial suppression, through the caste war, that they could survive conditions that by conventional analysis should have finished them. Maybe the trajectory changes. Maybe a different path was close. Neither reading is provable. The experiment was interrupted, and we cannot run it again. The research is not finished. It is not close to finished.
New cities are revealed every year by the LiDAR surveys. Entire urban complexes beneath the jungle canopy of northern Guatemala that nobody knew existed a decade ago. New texts are deciphered from newly excavated stelae. Old interpretations are revised when new evidence contradicts them, which it does regularly. The Maya are not a settled question. They are an active one, worked on by epigraphers and archaeologists and linguists and climate scientists across a dozen countries right now, with new results coming in continuously. If you want to hear about it when it happens, subscribe below. Next up, how the Maya counted time. That one needs its own video. Trust me, it's its own kind of madness. If you made it all the way here, thank you. The fact that you stayed through the whole thing means you're exactly who this was made for. If any part of this changed how you think about the Maya, or about what human civilizations can build under conditions that should have made it impossible, hit the like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it makes a real difference to whether this video reaches more people. One more question before you go. We ended with the counterfactual. What happens to the Maya if the Spanish never arrive? But here is the version of that question I keep thinking about. The Maya trajectory: expanding population, rising consumption, thinning ecological base, political systems unable to respond fast enough, is not unique to the Maya. If you were writing the script for that trajectory, with a different civilization in the lead role, how does it end differently? Leave your answer below. I read the comments. Subscribe to the channel. See you there.